Okay, Ulysses, you want to get started?
Yes, 10 a.m. sharp in Brazil, 9 a.m. in the East Coast in the US. Hi, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here. I'm Ulysses Araújo. I'm from Brazil, the University of São Paulo, and president of the PAN-PBL Association. And we are really excited and happy to have you all here for the for the opening session of this PBL 2019 Immersive Virtual International Conference. It's a challenge. It was a challenge, and it is a challenge for all of us to be part of this conference in this immersive world. So we expect to face some issues, some doubts, some problems, but we hope that everything is going to run smooth. As Ron said, Ron is here also, is from the CEO of the 3D ICC company, which develops the platform Turf. He, Nina are here to support us, and and as he said a few minutes ago, there are some help desks in the collaboration hub and a special room for that. If you have doubts or if you have questions about the functioning of the turf and the sessions, please, you can go there at any time and we'll be there to help you. And so this is a challenge for us. It is the first time we use this kind of tool or platform for a conference, and we expect to have a great time here and with your participation, with your questions, and we want to thank to all of you for being here, and especially to my colleague Daniel Wilson, who is already there in the camera. So I came here to introduce also Daniel, who is the director of the Project Zero at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And so Daniel didn't record a video as a keynote session. He's live in his camera, as you can see there, including his left. So it's a live session with Daniel, who is going to explain, and then at the end we are going to open for questions with you, and you might know how to make a question, right? You have a hand in the bottom of your turf. You can click there when you have a question at the end of the session. So it's my pleasure and honor to have Daniel here. We thank you very much for your time and your talk here. And that's it. I'm going to give him the stage or the virtual stage. those people those people who are here on the stage, please just click on the chair and you're going to be seated automatically by Turf. So thank you, Daniel. It's your time.
Thank you, Ulysses. And is there a way to not get the feedback loop on the audio?
Yeah, Ulysses, turn off your mic, please. Thank you very much.
Oh. Thank you. It's a real pleasure and adventure. Actually, this is my first live virtual conference, so I want to thank Ulysses for the opportunity, and I want to thank you all for stepping into this adventure together. And I have a lot of challenges in the real world, so I'm hoping that my challenges in the virtual world are easier, but I'm not sure that'll be the case with this talk. We'll see. But if at any point we have some technical glitches, we'll pause.
Okay, that was pretty funny. So we'll wait for Daniel to come back.
He just said about technical issues and he went out.
Looks like he's on his way back.
Okay, I think I'm back. Ron, can you confirm that I'm back?
Yes, you are. You want to share the screen though, but yeah, that was perfect timing because you said if we have any technical issues, we'll pause, and that's exactly where it stopped.
So that was my talk. Any questions? No, no.
That's pretty funny.
Okay, so it really is my honor to be part of this and in some small way offer some words as we begin this exploration into reinventing education, which is the theme of our time together and our discussions together. And so my goal in this opening session is in some ways to share some experiences around reinventing education, to open up a space where, as a researcher, talk about some of the conceptual space around reinventing education, some of the lessons learned around that conceptual space, and then to offer a tool, offer a way to think about one of the areas of challenge as we were addressing how to reinvent education. And the big idea here is that one of the areas of challenges surround beliefs of what learning is. And I want to leave you with a tool to think about beliefs about learning and offer some ideas about ways that we might be able to move some of those beliefs. And as Ulysses noted, at the end, we can open it up for some questions and reflections. So with your permission, I'll walk through that plan with you today, this morning. Well, let me think about this question of reinventing education. Now, as Ulysses mentioned, I am the director of a research center here at the Harvard Graduate School of Education called Project Zero. It's not a very aspirational name, I will admit. Zero kind of signifies nothing, but in fact, we've done quite a bit. We've been running for 52 years here at Harvard. It's the longest standing research center at the university. And Project Zero examines various facets of human potential. So we look at issues of creativity, human intelligence, learning, thinking. And over the 50 plus years of work, we've done quite a bit of work with schools in classrooms, quite a bit of work with states and districts, work with ministries of education, in larger policy, transnational policy groups. So this question of reinventing education is very much on our mind. When we think about how to reinvent something, well, we're starting with some place, some point in time, and we want to recast some of the historical trajectories of that. We want to change in some way what currently exists into some new form. And for us, we think about all the places in the world that have, in many ways, transformed what education and learning look like. And there are many places in the world. I'm assuming for those of you sitting in this virtual room, you could point to some places locally or globally that inspire us with visions of what education can look like. And it would be quite different from traditional education models. It would be quite different from traditional ways that students and teachers are interacting with one another. Well, the question is, how do they arrive there? From our experience working in various places around the world, I'd like to suggest that there are three interacting elements. And I think they're important for us to take note of these elements as we're considering reinventions in education. And these three elements are the interaction among beliefs, practices, and systems. And I'm going to unpack each one, but for our work here at Project Zero, we have about 25 research projects operating in 19 different countries. We are using this as a tool to think about how to change the state of education in various cultural contexts. So let me say a bit about each one. Well, what are beliefs? Well, beliefs are basically the assumptions we have about various dimensions of education. Beliefs like, well, what's the purpose of education? Beliefs about what is the nature of learning? Beliefs about what are the capacities of children? Beliefs about what are the capacities of teachers and leaders and community members. All of these are our deeply held assumptions about the world, the people in it, and how it should operate. And these beliefs, in many ways, guide our actions, whether it's consciously or subconsciously. So this could be a very tacit level of beliefs, or it could be more explicit. That's one dimension of the problem space, but it's certainly not all of the problem space. Another aspect is how these beliefs interact with practices. Now, what are practices? Well, practices are the everyday patterns of work. We can think of practices like how do we ask and call on students in classrooms, how we divide students into groups to do work, practices like how we take attendance. We can think of other kinds of macro practices like celebrations and exhibitions of student work. Practices in many ways are the cultural, social interaction patterns that happen again and again. In many ways, these are the routines that we see in a school or a location of education. Practices and beliefs interact. We have beliefs about, say, the capacities of students, and we have practices that are organized around those beliefs. Just to pause here for a moment, we could even think about project-based learning here. Project-based learning has a number of beliefs about it. Beliefs about learning, beliefs about the role of students and learners, beliefs about the role of interdisciplinarity. And then there are practices, pedagogies, if you will, that are organized around that. Practices of feedback, etc. Okay, let's go back now to the third dimension of this problem space of reinventing education. And this is the dimension of systems. And systems are the larger social shell in which we're operating. These are the places, the settings, the policies that shape practices and beliefs. These could be systems such as how a classroom is set up physically and in power dynamics. There could be policies that set in place norms. It could be ways that we incentivize teachers. It could have an economic slant as well as a social slant. So the systems are these physical or even social systems in which practices and beliefs are operating. When change in our experience happens successfully, it's when all three are being addressed simultaneously. So if we're, say, looking to reinvent education towards a project-based learning approach, and we're looking to intervene at a practice level, let's say at a pedagogical level, working with students, working with teachers, working with family members about what it looks like to do project-based learning, we need to take into account the beliefs, that is, the deeply held assumptions that students and other stakeholders have, and address them equally. And we need to take into account the system, the larger social structure. And if we look at schools or districts that have done this very, very well, for example, High Tech High, which is a school network over in San Diego, California, also very synergistic with project-based learning, they work at all three. They look at the beliefs about capacities of students and teachers. They put in place practices, micro practices, how students and teachers are interacting, how classes are divided, as well as larger macro practices, exhibitions, etc. And they create the systems, incentives, policies, other kinds of rules and regulations that support these beliefs and practices. When reinvention tends to fall apart in our experience, it's when it neglects one of these or both of these, both of the other two aspects. So for example, when we try to intervene at a practice level and we bump into competing beliefs, or we bump into some of the systems level policies or norms, and those systems and beliefs can erode and work against the practices we are aspiring to achieve. So that's a bit about the problem space. As we're thinking of reinventing education, to take into account different dimensions of education, beliefs, practices, and systems, think about what area are we intervening, and to consider how we're taking into account these other areas. In our experience, it's important to think about all three. Now let me talk about one particular area, and this is the area of beliefs, and specifically beliefs about learning. In some ways, we found in our work that beliefs about the nature of learning tend to get in the way often. So when we're talking about, introducing policies or norms that might support more progressive educational practices, when we're talking about more progressive educational practices, we often bump into deeply held assumptions specifically about what it means to learn. And as we're looking to the future, I think it's important for us to remember a bit about the past in education, to think about where some of these beliefs were set, and to consider that it's not a mistake that these beliefs are often difficult to shift. So digging into beliefs, I'd like to begin with a bit of a story, and it's a story that takes us back in time. So imagine the year is 1899, and we are at the World's Fair in Paris. And at the World's Fair in Paris, the organizers contacted an artist named Jean-Marc Coté, and they asked this artist to create different renditions of what the future of different kinds of aspects of society would look like in the year 2000. So he's looking ahead, 100 plus years from the point of view of 1899. And he created all sorts of very interesting, often satirical visions of what society might look like, what hospitals might look like in the year 2000, what the postal service might look like in the year 2000. And he created an image of what schools might look like in the year 2000. I'd like to share that image because I think it illustrates not only these three dimensions that I mentioned earlier about the challenges of reinventing education, but I think it specifically illustrates what the deeply held beliefs are around learning. This is the image that Jean-Marc Coté depicted, and ask yourself as you see it, what does this image say about beliefs of learning? So you can think to yourself about what you're noticing. A number of students presumably sitting quietly with these interesting headsets affixed to their ears. Connected to the headsets are these wires. What look like wires are connected to some kind of machine, it looks like, right? There's this old white, presumably man, who's taking what looks like books off the shelf, feeding them into this machine, and this poor soul is cranking this machine. And a lot of provocative and often kind of funny things we could read into, but it's in many ways a sinister picture, because we could ask ourselves, schools don't really look like this in the year 2000 and in this century. But in some ways, they do reflect this picture. Because this picture that Jean-Marc Coté rendered in 1899 depicts a very classic view of conceptions of learning. That learning is individual, that learning is isolated, that learning is a transmission process of getting information as efficiently into students' heads as possible, and that learning has innate power structures in it. Someone is selecting knowledge that is then transmitted into the heads of learners. Whether or not schools physically look like this and classrooms look like this belief about learning, that it's individual, that it's passive and transmission-based, that it's even uniform and standardized. I mean, everyone is presumably getting the same stuff, is a pervasive conception of learning. And it's no mistake that it's pervasive. I mean, this kind of conception of learning was set many, many years ago. Here's a picture of Horace Mann, who's credited in the United States as sort of the father of public schools. And when he created the first sort of public schooling system in the mid-19th century, say 50 years before Jean-Marc Coté's picture, very little was known about learning. I mean, the field of psychology hadn't even been born when Horace Mann created forms of public schooling. So what was known were these kind of mythological views of learning, that it's passive, that it's transmission-based, etc. Now, I believe that that's why we continue to see many of these beliefs continue to play out in today's world, because the practices and the systems that were organized around this belief were set in motion, almost 200 years ago. We see classrooms organized by age, we see curricular sequences, we see power structures, etc., that were organized around these original beliefs of learning. And it's no surprise then when we walk into many classrooms, we do see very similar kinds of systems and practices. Again, I think organized around these old and antiquated beliefs about learning. Now, I know many of you in this virtual room probably don't agree with these classical views of learning, and for that I'm grateful. But probably many of you in this room have bumped up against the resistance, say, of introducing new practices and encountered many of these traditional views about the nature of learning. And so what I'd like to do is, create a review of 4 big ways that learning has transformed since the days of Horace Mann, since the days of Jean-Marc Coté's picture. And many of these ways, I suspect, are synergistic with the work that we're aspiring to do in this community. So, given that some classrooms look like this, not all classrooms do. I pulled a picture of a classroom that's nearby me here in Boston. I invite you to look at it. This is a very different looking kind of classroom, isn't it? This is the freshman year engineering course at Olin College outside of Boston. As you see, it looks quite different than a traditional setup. There are no desks and rows. Students are scattered about. In some ways, it's messy. There's all sorts of sticky notes in the background. There's tools hanging. It's very difficult to find the teacher. So on the one hand, we can imagine that the systems and the practices in this classroom are quite different, but they're effective, and they're effective at Olin College because they have different beliefs about the nature of learning. And because they have different beliefs about the nature of learning, their practices and systems have effectively reinvented what education looks like in this engineering classroom, but also at the college itself. So, what are the beliefs about learning in this kind of a classroom? Well, that it's not individual, that it's certainly not standardized and uniform, that it's not just transmission-based. So what might be some of these beliefs? Well, historically, what I'd like to put on our minds is that there are lots of ways learning as a psychological construct has shifted. And I'd like to just draw our attention to 4 important ways as we're considering how to reinvent education going forward. The 4 ways I'd like to draw our attention this morning is that to note that we know that learning is complex, that learning is visible, that learning is social, and that learning is informal. I'd like to unpack each one, give some historical context for them, but then invite you to think about how your own change initiatives might be reflecting these. Let's start with learning is complex. Well, here's our old friend, Jean Piaget. And I think we could give him credit here. I mean, his probably seminal contribution to a conception of learning is that it is indeed not uniform. Learning is a gloriously in northern Italy. This is a setting that, if you don't know about, is quite inspirational. It has many kinds of unique qualities, but one of the qualities is that they embrace a belief of learning that it is in fact complex, that it emerges individually and at group level with important variability that is unpredictable. And so they organize their pedagogical practices around that. So one of the pedagogical practices is something called documentation. I won't say more about it other than that it's a process of collecting evidence along the way of learning. And everyone collects the evidence, including students. So you see a young boy here drawing a picture of children playing a game. It's a game of Ring Around the Rosie, but they're making it 2-dimensional so that he could draw a picture of it in 2D. So Reggio Emilia is an interesting context for a lot of reasons, but I want to draw our attention to it because their belief that learning is complex is illustrative, and it also organizes their practices and systems there. That's one. Here's another conception of learning that has transformed over the years, and this is that learning is not invisible. It's not just in the heads of learners. It's not something that just can be transmitted individually and then resides within one's mind. But that learning is innately a visible process. This is the psychologist Mary Washburn. In the early 1900s, she was credited as being one of the first thinkers in psychology to create theories that learning and thinking is an externalized or externalized processes. That is, the ways in which humans come to learn and the ways in which humans are thinking can be mediated through objects and artifacts. So it's not just a black box in one's mind, but the various things we create, the various symbols we render, things like language itself, is an artifact. And that artifact embodies the learning and the thinking, as well as mediates the learning and the thinking. So at that time, it was quite a radical theory. And since then, there are many other psychologists and educators who have extended that point of view. We can see many practices that extend that point of view. This, again, is an image from Olin College. You can think of design thinking and design thinking pedagogies, which is what they use at Olin College, as a process which honors the belief that learning is visible. That is, through the process of ideation, in order to design well, we have to render in various ways what we know, what we think we know, and that externalization in and of itself will mediate what we know and what we think we know. There are other practices too. I'm just going to note a trajectory of research here at Project Zero called Making Thinking Visible. And this is about a 25-year research trajectory that has looked at various practices of externalizing thinking. There are dozens and dozens of practices, or what they call routines, that have been used in classrooms all over the world in a variety of cultural contexts. And that, again, we can view it as a very interesting set of practices, but I'm drawing our attention to it because underneath the practices are very important beliefs about learning that are addressed. Okay, learning is complex, learning is visible. Let's talk about learning as social, and this is probably one of the least controversial ones, particularly for this audience. I think we all would recognize this figure on the left. This is Lev Vygotsky, and Vygotsky, of course, is credited with ushering in the view of social constructivism, building on and connecting to Piagetian theory. But this is the view that learning is not just an individual process. Learning is mediated through the relationships and interactions we have with other humans. So if we look at language development and other forms of coming to know, Vygotsky's contribution here is that language development particularly is mediated through the relationships and interactions we have with other human beings. So the social process is crucial in learning. Now, I don't think that that's controversial. My guess is that many of us embrace that. We see teachers all over the world creating small groups in their classrooms, creating interactions, creating moments in which students can share ideas and pool knowledge and skills and activities. Certainly project-based learning embraces that, and it embraces it because there's a belief that learning is in fact a social process. And there's some other kinds of interesting practices we could see. I don't know if you can see this image very well, but it's one of my favorite images, which is from an auditorium at the University of Iowa. And auditoriums are traditionally lecture halls. I mean, in many ways, the virtual lecture hall that we're sitting in today, or virtually sitting in today, is designed very similarly. But there's an interesting tweak if you look at this picture closely. You'll notice that the seats in the lecture hall turn so students can face one another. Now, I've given many lectures in standard lecture halls that have fixed seats, and I ask people to turn and talk with one another. It can be tricky sometimes. But here's a setting, if you will, a social system, a physical system, that gives affordances, that embraces the social belief of learning. So that's kind of interesting to think about small ways that practices and systems can align with the social belief of learning. And we can think of the digital worlds that we're living in today and other kinds of digital worlds that the youth are living in as well. In many ways, the digital worlds that my children, who are 12 and 10, are engaging in are highly social, interacting with peers, not only through gaming, but other kinds of skill development. I mean, my 12-year-old is learning beading through YouTube videos and uploading other kinds of videos of her rock climbing, which is a hobby of hers. And she gets feedback and tips from other kinds of peers digitally. So these virtual environments can be designed with this social belief as well. Here's an example of one virtual learning environment here at Project Zero. It's a multi-year research study called Out of Eden Learn. If you're interested, you can learn more about it, but it's a cross-cultural learning platform. They have about 60,000 students engaged from a variety of countries and cultural contexts. And students engage in practices of close observation and uploading images and reflections of their everyday life, but sharing them across cultures. So you might have a student in Sao Paulo sharing images of their everyday life with a student in rural Afghanistan. And they'd be interacting through protocols and different routines and sharing what they're noticing about one another's experiences. So there are interesting digital environments that are founded on this idea of learning as a social activity. There's other virtual worlds. This is another ongoing project at Project Zero called EcoMove, in which it is a virtual world in which students from different kinds of classrooms can engage in scientific experiments, often scientific experiments that they couldn't do very easily in the real world. They can speed up time, they can slow time down, they can go back historically, they can change variables in the environment, so they can manipulate aspects of this virtual world and learn more about ecology and sustainability and the effects of climate change. So there's lots of other kinds of examples. These are just two, but I think there's a robust set of platforms which I think are founded on beliefs of learning is social. And I think the not so interesting learning platforms don't share those beliefs. When we have learning platforms that are simply founded on learning is individual or learning is a very isolated transmission-based activity. Learning is complex, visible, social. Let's get to the last transformation I wanted to draw our attention to, and that is learning is informal. And here's an image of John Dewey, who I believe in his writings back in the 1920s and 1930s began to articulate an idea that probably took about 50 years to germinate for many psychologists. But it was this idea that much of how we learn as human beings is guided by the ways in which we create our goals, the ways that we self-design our processes, and the ways in which we have agency to evaluate our outcomes. Now, Dewey wrote quite a bit about this notion of self-directed inquiry. Psychologists and other social scientists in the 1970s and 80s began to look at informal learning. And this is this idea that formal learning is when goals, processes, and the evaluation happens externally to the learner. So we can think of sort of a classic educational context where a teacher sets the goal, a teacher creates the learning process, and a teacher evaluates the outcome. That would be sort of classic formal. And informal is when the learner sets the goal, the learner sets the process or designs the learning process, and the learner evaluates the outcome. Now, of course, there can be a blend of each, and I think good educators often do blend both. Good educators have goals, and they invite students to create goals. Good educators create a process, but they often invite students to create parts of the process as well. And good educators evaluate outcomes, but they also invite students in doing self-critique and other kinds of feedback and evaluation. So it's not to say it's always formal versus informal. But this idea of informal learning took hold about 25 years ago in a series of studies which began to show that most of what we come to know as human beings is informal. That is, it is self-directed, it is processes that we're creating, and it is when we're engaged in evaluating the outcomes, particularly professionally. So if we look at how professionals learn, most of our professional knowledge is developed informally, not formally. That's not to say some of it isn't developed formally, but most of it is. So this notion of informal learning really has generated some interesting pedagogical practices and structures. Here's one. There's what we call a maker movement in education. This is an image from a maker fair where we see different generations of learners coming together to build things that they want to build. We have children, we have parents, we have other people from other generations coming together, all to co-create things. That's just one practice, but it's an important practice because this is an informal learning setting where the learners are setting goals, developing their processes, evaluating outcomes. There's other forms of self-directed learning. There are full schools that are created around sort of free learning, If we look at the Swedish schools of free and open learning, if we look at a school network called the Big Picture School Networks, the students themselves are engaged in the creation of goals and processes and evaluating their learning outcomes. So learning as informal is one more of these dimensions. And a project that's been looking at, say, the maker movement at Project Zero is called Agency by Design, specifically looking at the outcomes of this informal learning approach. And one of the big findings here is that, no surprise, when we're engaging in informal learning processes, we're developing learners' sense of agency. Okay, let me step back and bring this to a conclusion. So what I've put forward as a provocation, if you will, is that if we look at how learning as a conception has been reinvented historically, here are 4 ways we can point to. Learning as complex, learning as visible, learning as social, learning as informal. And this often is in conflict with traditional beliefs about learning, that learning is uniform, that learning is individual and largely invisible, that learning is passive, and that learning has a power structure in which externally the control is put, so that learning is formal. So it's no wonder that we butt heads against these more historical conceptions of learning, because there's practices and systems that were developed against these kinds of beliefs. However, we do see settings where these kinds of beliefs take root, largely because they've been crafting these beliefs explicitly. They design practices, and they create the social systems in which they can be held. So this idea that learning can be viewed, the beliefs about learning can be viewed as being reinvented over the years, and probably will continually be reinvented over the years, I think is important. But situating that within this tool again, that situating within beliefs, practices, and systems, I think is important, because as we're considering how to reinvent education, how we reinvent purposes, how we reinvent the kinds of pedagogies, and how we reinvent the larger social systems in which these pedagogies and purposes will thrive, we're going to encounter resistance. And I think what I'll close with is that that resistance is oftentimes the best form of data. So as we go forward with our experiments to change the nature of education, in whatever kind of setting, could be a classroom, could be a home, could be a community, we should be keeping in mind these 3 dimensions. But when we look for a point of intervention, say it's at a practice level, when we encounter resistance, we should pay particular attention to the quality of that resistance. Where is it coming from? Might it be a belief that we need to unearth and surface and be more explicit and honor that belief? Because these beliefs have a logic to them. There's a reason these beliefs have taken root and are pervasive. We can't just dismiss them. Or is the resistance coming at a systems level? And again, paying particular attention to what at the systems level are we noticing? And not just dismissing it, but honoring the resistance. Because again, the systems have been created for a natural reason, historically and culturally. We can't just dismiss the resistance when we encounter it, but we must look carefully and closely, engage in it, and understand it, I think, with humility and with honor. So with that, I would like to bring this to a close. I again thank you for your attention. I want to thank Ulysses again and you all for stepping into this virtual adventure, and particularly to Ron on your end and Jared on my end for making this work, I hope, so smoothly. And I'm going to pretend at this point there's a virtual applause.
Yay!
Virtual applause. So I'm going to turn it over to Ulysses. Is that correct?
Yes. So I really thank you, Daniel, for your fantastic words, and I think was really nice, clarifying for the time we are in education, in the time for reinventing education. And let's try for the first time to have a Q&A, a virtual Q&A. So Nina is, I think, is leading the session
Yes.
right now.
Yes.
And so if you have a hand in the bottom of your turf platform, if you want to make a question or a comment, please just click in the hand in the bottom of your turf platform, and then you give you the voice.
Wow,
Don't be
no
shy.
questions.
I was on mute the whole time. Sorry.
Yeah,
So it
so
looks like
if you look,
Matthew has a
yeah.
question.
Very good.
Just a small one. I missed the name of the female who you mentioned regarding visible thinking.
Her name is Mary Washburn. She was a psychologist in, I think it was NYU or New York at the very least. Her work was in the early 1900s, not very well known at the time, but many researchers who have pushed forward this idea of externalization of thought and externalization of learning note her as sort of the kind of the first psychologist to posit this theory.
Okay, we have another question. I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce your name. If you, hold down your control key. Actually, left click your microphone because you're muted. You see the red X, the lower left of your screen? Yeah. Okay, now, oops, hold down your control key while you talk, but don't
Yeah,
keep
can you hear me now?
Perfect.
Yeah, thank
Excellent.
you. I like very much the presentation. I like to, when I see your, in your first slide that you have beliefs, systems, and practices. And you talked about the beliefs. I study like system thinking, and like the beliefs sounds like to me like the mental models that the fully ingrained way of thinking. And then the mental models, I think, that determine the system, that the way they create the systems, and the system leads to the practice, the pattern of behavior. Could you please explain a little bit about this in the system thinking way of, in the system thinking theory?
Yeah, that's a very, very apt connection. It's a really good point. I mean, it has.
Hey, sorry to bug. I'm still trying to make this work. I didn't give up. So,
Wait, should I continue?
Tanisha, just a
have
second,
speakers
please.
on your thing.
Nina, can you mute Tanisha, please?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so am I good?
Yeah.
I think I'm good. Yeah, okay. So, yeah, it's a nice connection. I mean, if one looks at systems thinking and Peter Senge's work and others, this idea of mental models as an important dimension is very, very parallel to this and informs this kind of work. It is an interesting question about what's the pattern of causality here. I mean, where does mental model, do they inform the systems? Does the system inform the mental models? I mean, I think there's probably, bidirectionality across all three, and I think that's why those arrows were pointing around. But, there's a very provocative line of research which says if we want to change, practices are really important lever into human behavior. And let me just share kind of a provocative piece of research. And it's research around doctors who work with drug addicts. And although there's a chemical basis for some of these patterns of behavior, but the interventions that are often most useful are the ones that ask addicts to change their patterns of behavior that then shape beliefs in some of their larger social systems. So behavior, it's not a one-to-one correspondence between working with addicts and thinking about the schools and education, but I think it's a provocative piece of work which says that behaviors, even if they're really, really hard, like addicted level of behaviors, the behavior as an intervention point might be more powerful than at the other points. But I'm not saying that that's where we should always intervene, but it is sort of an interesting body of literature there. I think someone else. Yeah.
I don't see anybody else with their hand up. Tanisha was just having trouble with her sound.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Okay, Alexandra, you want to try?
Yeah, sorry about that. I was helping Tanisha.
So Alexandra, your mic is turned off. Click on the left click on the microphone at the bottom to turn it on.
Hello, this is Alex from IFSP Brazil, and thanks a lot for your presentation, very interesting. My question is, I have been researching the project-based learning for computer education in Brazil, and what I found is what was predicted that on kind of more instructivist cultures, like maybe Latin America or something like this, people still have the tendency to believe that a classroom is a kind of lecture or kind of well prepared and finished education. So what I found at this research that it will be published yet, but the key point is maybe we have a gradient where we can go from a situation here, and then we are going up and down like waves, and then moving to the more constructivist approach. So maybe it's not kind of this versus that, or constructivist versus instructivist, or culture versus culture, or something like this, but like waves on the sea going slowly from the left to the right and other parts like this. So I don't know if this is the point, but I feel something like this on this presentation. So maybe something like this.
It's a really interesting point. I think I hear you saying that if we think about the ways that we're interacting as learners, and as we're interacting with teachers who are shaping our learning, we see, gradients, as you say. We see oftentimes more traditional modes. It could be transmission modes. And we might see other more progressive modes. And it might be a little too idealistic to simply say it's all one thing. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, it's more like this. We have to, people need time to transit from one kind of thinking to another. So they give one step and then, oh, it's working. So I will open more the class and one step more. And and the kind of teacher kind bring another teachers together. So let's come with me, and people step by step, because teachers don't have much time, and also learners don't have much time. They still have the content to learn, right? So they are kind of waves. They go more to a kind of constructivist or more a kind of collective learning, and then they step back a little bit more for kind of individual kind of test or kind of approach, right? And then they slowly going year after year or time after time going that way. So this is more or less the point. I would like to know if this is the the way, you guys have been approaching or something like this?
Yeah, it's a beautiful. I love how you're capturing that. Is this, we have to understand human development and trajectories, including the ones of the teachers. I mean, I can't tell you how many ill-designed projects I've been part of where they've forgotten that the adults, the teachers, and the other adults in the school are as important as learners as the students. And we must really understand how to support human development and learning for all of the people involved. The best schools put the learning and development of their teachers as a high priority. And oftentimes the quality of the learning of the teachers directly mirrors the quality of the learning of the students. That is, if we have teachers engaged in high quality development through their own professional experiences, then we'll see high quality learning translate into the classroom. So thank you for that point.
Okay, it looks
Okay,
like
we
we
have
have,
a
yeah,
few minutes, but maybe João, you
there's
have a
another
new question?
question.
Yeah, I'd like to make a direct question. How, in your point of view, how to change the professor's mental models? Because, for example, I'll give an example here in Brazil. A lot of professors take a PhD course here in Brazilian university. When they finish their PhD, they are going to other universities and teach there, and they replicate the way they learn. So so it's very difficult to do a change in the way the people think. For example, here I teach project-based learning, like using community-based approach, and then I have a lot of resistance, opposition from other professors that use the classical way of teaching, passing the content to the student. So my question is, what are your ideas about how to change the professor's mental model since they are under the system deforming professors the same way?
It's a really important question. And as a general kind of approach, again, this triangle that we use very, very often in our work at Project Zero would suggest that, if we're trying to influence the beliefs, we can look at practices and we can look at systems. So if we look at systems, then we're looking at, what kind of incentive structures or rules or policies or physical settings can we design to basically create what we would call a bind for the professor. So a bind would be where they can't go about doing what they were doing easily anymore. So let's say, let's shift some of the incentivization, or let's shift some of the ways I'm going to be evaluated, or let's shift even the design of the classroom so that it's hard to do traditional lectures and is supporting more project-based learning. Or we go at the practice level and we begin to work, say, about, what does it look like? What does it look like to design projects? What does it look like to create smaller kinds of projects that could be inserted? What does it look like to engage students in feedback? Or what does it look like to engage students in designing their own goals? Maybe it's a design thinking process. So we could introduce some of these practices to, say, a professor. And again, it will create a bind. That is, it will create some conflict within the professor that they can't go about achieving their goals anymore. Now, here, though, is the problem. I think, in my view, the problem is that operating at a systems and at a practice level often can be coercive. I mean, that is, we're coercing the bind from the professor. And if we adopt that approach, we likely will undermine some of the developmental shifts that we want to occur within a professor, or anyone, frankly. I think an alternative approach is to work in a more agentic way, to create the autonomy for the say, professor in this case, to understand what are his or her goals, what are his or her needs or problems they're facing, and then work at a practice or a systems level to make some shifts that will help the professor change some of their mental models, but it's really through understanding what their needs and what their goals are. That's a more agentic way for shifting, I think, the mental models. Now, that's not to say that everyone has the same kinds of motivations and mental models. I mean, oftentimes we'll have to use coercive means, but I think leading with more agentic and empowering ways to shift mental models is always the better approach.
Okay.
We're out of time, but I want to thank you all for the questions. Very, very stimulating, and I hope that in some small way the ideas here can orient some of the interactions and might feed into some of the discussions and other sessions you have today and tomorrow. So thank you again so much for your attention.
Thank you very much.
That's my claps. Daniel.
Unmute, clap.
All for you.
Well, Daniel, was really fantastic. I thank you very much for your nice and clear presentation. I thank you all for being here for this first initiative and the first session today. I would like to recognize here the presence of Alexander Schlag. Alexander is the responsible for us for being here. Yeah. Alexander used to work in the Polytechnic of Singapore. Now he's working in Iberia, their company in Spain. And at the closing ceremony of our conference last year in Santa Clara, California, he made a suggestion. Why don't we go to the virtual world? And the executive board of the PAN-PBL decided to take the challenge. And so thanks to Alexander, we are here with this first initiative because of his suggestion at the last moment. So as the last comment, so in our program right now, we have the interactive break time. It's 30 minutes break. You can do whatever you want. But you can also go to the collaboration hub and meet people, talk to people, see the posters which are already hanged in the rooms there, and also go to the help desk there. So thank you all, and see you soon in the next room or in the next session. Thank you, Daniel.